The hum of the environmental regulators in Lecture Hall 402 died down the moment Professor Terrell Vox stepped through the heavy sliding glass doors. He did not carry a datapad. He did not offer a customary greeting. He simply walked to the center of the sunken amphitheater, his graying, armored scales catching the harsh, synthetic light, and tapped a single command onto the master console. The massive holographic projector suspended from the vaulted ceiling hummed to life, casting a cold, glacial blue glow over the faces of over 300 students hailing from 82 different star systems. Applied xenobiology has always been a theoretical discipline within these walls, Vox began, his voice a gravelly baritone that cut through the silence like a kinetic scalpel. For 3 years, you have studied behavioral matrices. You have watched sanitized holovids. You have engaged with safely contained simulations. That era of comfort ends today. He swiped a clawed hand through the air. The blue glow of the projector shifted instantly to a violent, arterial red. Your final examination will not be a simulation, Vox stated, letting the heavy words hang in the chilled air. It will be a direct, unshielded observation of an apex predator in a localized live habitat. You will record, you will analyze, and you will survive. Your final grades will be determined exclusively by the quality of your empirical data. The silence that followed was absolute. In an academy overflowing with the brightest and most ambitious minds of the Intergalactic Coalition, every student understood the unspoken addendum to his syllabus. This was an examination where you could easily trade your life for a passing grade. Dax Calder leaned back in his standard-issue chair, his dark eyes fixed on the crimson holograph hovering above the amphitheater floor. He was one of the few humans in the academy, a primate from a Class 9 Deathworld known as Earth, and he found the sudden, palpable spike of pheromonal terror in the room deeply fascinating. Beside him sat his randomly assigned fieldwork group. To his left was Severix, a multi-limbed insectoid from the subterranean hive cities of Xylos, whose mandibles were currently clicking in a rapid, erratic rhythm indicative of extreme neurological stress. Severix was their pattern analyzer, a biological supercomputer capable of calculating probability matrices in fractions of a second. Hovering just above the desk to Dax's right was Nolly, as a photonic entity from a nebula-dwelling species. Nolly had no physical body in the traditional, carbon-based sense, existing instead as a cohesive swarm of bioluminescent energy confined within an intricate environmental suit. They communicated through rapid shifts in light spectrums, and right now, Nolly was flashing a frantic, staccato ultraviolet. It was the universal photonic translation for blind panic. Rounding out the group was Orun, a towering mineraloid whose dense, crystalline body groaned softly as he shifted his immense weight in his reinforced seat. Orun originated from a high-gravity, magma-rich planet, making him an unparalleled expert in thermodynamics and volatile terrain navigation. Groups of 4, Vox's voice echoed again, breaking the tension. The roster of available subjects has just been pushed to your personal terminals. Choose your predator. You have exactly 24 hours to lock in your selection, but I highly suggest you do it now. The less lethal subjects are available on a strict first-come, first-served basis. Instantly, the lecture hall erupted into a frantic symphony of tapping claws, swiping tentacles, and panicked vocalizations. Every group in the room scrambled to claim the lowest-tier predators available on the list. Within seconds, the relatively safe options, creatures like the venomous but slow-moving spinehounds of Arcus, or the blind cave stalkers of Emir, were grayed out. They were eagerly claimed by students desperate to secure a dangerous but manageable target. They wanted something just lethal enough to impress the academic board, but well within the safety thresholds of the Academy's automated emergency extraction protocols. Dax did not rush. While Severix frantically inputted override commands, trying desperately to secure a mid-tier venom spitter, Dax calmly scrolled past the claimed territories, He scrolled past the red warning labels. He scrolled past the double red restricted tags. He kept dragging the holographic list downward, down to the very bottom of the data stream, where the entries were marked not in cautionary red, but in an abyssal, void-like black. Apex Black Tier. One name caught his attention, sitting completely untouched at the absolute bottom of the registry. Umbraxis. Dax expanded the heavily encrypted file. The holographic display on their shared desk glitched momentarily, as if the data itself was resisting observation. The Umbraxis was classified as an ambush predator, a localized terror that manipulated ambient gravitational fields to crush prey and severely distort their spatial perception before moving in for the kill. The fatality rate listed on the screen was a staggering 99.9%. But it was not the astronomical death toll that glued Dax's eyes to the screen. It was a single, easily overlooked string of text buried deep in the observation history notes. Does not react stably to drones or simulation models. Incomplete behavioral data. Specimen exhibits illogical environmental interactions when unobserved by biological entities. Dax leaned forward, his pulse steadying into a calm rhythm. The entire intergalactic scientific community, armed with unfathomable technology and centuries of data collection, could not figure out how this thing actually behaved. It defied their sterile drones. It broke their clean, mathematical simulations. "I have successfully secured a territorial acid weaver," Severix announced, his mandibles slowing their frantic clicking as he let out a rush of filtered air. Calculated fatality risk is only 17% if we maintain a vertical environmental clearance of 15 meters. It is highly acceptable. "Cancel the request," Dax said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the distinct, heavy gravity that the alien students had come to associate with his Deathworlder biology. Severix froze, mid-keystroke. Nali pulsed a questioning, muted yellow. Orun turned his heavy, crystalline head, the sound of grinding tectonic plates filling the small space between them. "Look at this," Dax instructed, flicking the Umbraxis file to the exact center of their shared terminal. The moment the black tier warning flashed across the screen, Nali turned a blinding, terrified white. Orun let out a low, resonant rumble that vibrated through the metal floorboards. "Absolutely not," Severix hissed, his mechanical voice synthesizer struggling to translate the sheer speed of his native clicks. "That is an Umbraxis. It is an Apex Black classification. Choosing that subject is not an academic exercise. Calder. It is a live broadcast suicide ritual." Nali flashed a rapid, blinding sequence of crimson bursts, the text immediately translating on Dax's optical interface. "The gravitational shear alone will shatter Orun into gravel. It will entirely disperse my photonic containment field. It will flatten you and Severix into biological paste within 10 seconds. There is zero logical foundation for this choice." "There is every logical foundation," Dax countered, his expression remaining entirely neutral. He pointed a steady finger at the glaring anomaly in the data logs. "Look at the footnotes. The Academy does not actually understand how this creature hunts. They know it kills, but they do not know why it ignores technological drones, or why its behavioral matrix completely collapses inside a simulation. They are terrified of it simply because they cannot quantify it. And we are supposed to quantify it by offering ourselves as physical bait," Orun rumbled, his deep voice laced with genuine, heavy disbelief. Dax looked at his three alien companions. He saw their genuine terror, a perfectly logical survival instinct, honed by millennia of civilized, scientifically safe evolution. But Dax was a human. He was born on a planet where the weather routinely tried to drown coastal cities, where the tectonic plates cracked open to swallow towns whole, where the wildlife viewed humans as a challenging but highly rewarding meal. The creatures misunderstood by the entire galactic scientific community are the exact ones actually worth studying, Dax said, his voice dropping to a calm, deadpan register. If we pick the acid weaver, we will spend 5 days taking atmospheric soil samples and writing a report that 1,000 terrified students have written before us. My greatest fear is not being killed by a monster. My greatest fear is submitting a soulless, entirely safe, completely meaningless research paper. Before any of them could formulate another frantic protest, Dax reached swiftly across the console. He bypassed Severix's provisional lock, inputted his own biometric human clearance, and highlighted the Umbraxis file. He pressed confirm. A harsh, echoing chime rang out across Lecture Hall 402. The massive holographic board at the front of the room updated instantly. Beside the terrifying, void black entry for the Umbraxis, a brand new line of glowing text appeared. Claimed by Group 7. Lead Dax Calder. Earth. The frantic murmuring of 300 students stopped dead. The silence that slammed down over the amphitheater was so heavy, it felt as though the gravity in the room had been artificially doubled. Every set of eyes, every faceted compound lens, every ocular sensor turned slowly, mechanically, toward the back row where Dax sat. They looked at him not with awe, not with respect, but with the specific, grim pity usually reserved for the terminally ill. Down on the lecture floor, Professor Terrell Vox slowly raised his heavy head. He looked past the hundreds of terrified students, his piercing gaze locking directly onto the solitary human from Earth. Vox did not shout. He did not reprimand them for their arrogance. He simply spoke into the amplification system, his voice devoid of any warmth or comfort. Group 7 has locked an Apex Black subject. Academy protocol dictates a mandatory grace period for such extreme selections. Mr. Calder, you and your group have 1 night to reconsider and withdraw your registration without academic penalty. Vox paused, and though the physical distance between them was vast, Dax could clearly see the ancient, weary certainty burning in the professor's eyes. It was the distinct look of a veteran who was already mentally drafting a gruesome casualty report. Class dismissed, Vox concluded abruptly, turning his back on the hall. Dax remained perfectly still in his seat as the rest of the students practically fled the room, treating the space around Group 7 like the epicenter of a virulent, airborne plague. He stared at the blank screen, his heart beating in a slow, steady, and terrifyingly calm rhythm. The die was cast, and the hunt had officially begun. By the time the third solar cycle of the afternoon shifted, the artificial light filtering through the great glass atrium, the news had outpaced the Academy's official data streams entirely. A human had locked in an Apex Black predator. Everywhere Dax Calder walked down the sweeping, anti-gravity transit corridors, through the lush, hydroponic gardens, and past the pressurized biological laboratories, conversations abruptly died. The chatter morphed into low, clicking whispers, guttural hums of disbelief, or flashing optical warning spectrums depending on the species. In the main dining concourse, a cavernous, multi-leveled hall, normally packed to the brim with thousands of mingling students from across the galaxy, Group 7 sat in a state of absolute, undeniable isolation. A perfect 10-meter radius of empty seating surrounded their metallic table. The other students, despite their diverse evolutionary backgrounds, all seemingly agreed on one universal superstition: proximity to the dead was highly illogical. And sitting near the human who chose the Umbraxis was tantamount to catching a terminal illness. The space around them felt like a vacuum, a bizarrely quiet bubble in the center of deafening cafeteria noise. 2 of the very few other Terran students on the station, a pair of senior engineering cadets, approached the perimeter of this empty void, but adamantly refused to cross it. The taller of the 2, a young woman from the established Martian colonies, crossed her arms tightly over her chest. She coldly informed Dax that representing their newly inducted species by becoming a spectacular, televised smear of carbon was not doing Earth any diplomatic favors. She strongly urged him to withdraw his registration immediately, reminding him in a sharp tone that being famous for sheer, unadulterated stupidity was not the legacy the human race needed to leave on the galactic stage. Dax simply nodded, acknowledging her concern without offering a single word of agreement, prompting the two Terrans to walk away in sheer frustration. Before Dax could even return his attention to his ration pack, a shadow fell heavy and dark across their isolated table. Rev Tal, a highly decorated senior cadet from the avian predator caste of Vale, slammed his scaled, four-taloned hands onto the metal surface. His iridescent feathers flared outward in a classic, aggressive display of biological dominance, instantly drawing the eager attention of hundreds of onlookers who were already watching the human with morbid curiosity. "You are a pathetic spectacle," Rev hissed, his sharp beak clicking rhythmically with contempt. "You are an uneducated Deathworld animal who has not yet learned to fear the right things. You think your primitive, heavy-gravity biology makes you special here. You are going to get your entire group liquidated because you mistake utter ignorance for bravery." Dax did not flinch. He did not raise his voice, nor did he shift his posture into a defensive stance. He slowly finished his synthetic meal, wiped his mouth with a napkin, and looked up calmly into Rev's multifaceted, predatory eyes. The absolute lack of any prey response from the human seemed to cause a slight, confused twitch in the avian's feathers. "What subject did your tactical group register for, Rev?" Dax asked, his tone perfectly flat and devoid of any intimidation. Rev puffed his chest out further, asserting his senior status. "A crested voidstalker. It is a mid-tier predator, a perfectly balanced, highly strategic challenge for a senior tactical team looking to maximize their observation scores." Dax offered a faint, chilling smile that did not reach his dark eyes. "Good. You do the assignment just to pass the class. I am doing the assignment to find out what no one else in this entire galaxy understands. Enjoy your passing grade." Rev bristled entirely, opening his beak to screech a vicious retort, but the unwavering, dead-eyed stare of the human unsettled him deep within his avian instincts. He found nothing to attack, no fear to exploit. Rev violently turned on his heel and stalked away, the surrounding crowd of alien students parting for him in a heavy, tense silence. At their isolated table, Severix had been unusually quiet during the entire confrontation. His four secondary arms were a blur of motion over his personal data terminal. "I bypassed the standard cultural safety filters on the archives," the insectoid whispered, his synthesized voice trembling with a metallic rattle. "I pulled the unrestricted, raw planetary data for your homeworld. I needed to understand your baseline logic." Nali shifted their energy field to a deep, inquisitive indigo, hovering significantly closer to the holographic screen. Orun leaned his massive, rocky torso forward, the friction of his joints sounding like grinding boulders. "Earth is not a standard habitable zone," Severix continued, his primary mandibles vibrating with shock. "It is classified by the old explorer fleets as an extreme death world. The global ecosystem is actively hostile and entirely chaotic. Your weather patterns are violently unpredictable. Tectonic instability is a constant, unceasing factor. You possess thousands of unique predatory species, extreme thermal variations, and yet your specific kind did not just survive there. You achieved total, undisputed planetary dominance. How is that statistically possible?" Dax looked down at his scarred hands, thinking of the roaring oceans of his youth. "I did not grow up in one of our heavily shielded megacities. I was raised on the coastal salvage and rescue stations on the eastern seaboard. Where I am from, children have to learn how to read approaching hurricane patterns before they even learn basic mathematics. We are taught very early how to spot deadly rip currents, how to anticipate the sudden collapse of structurally compromised bulkheads, and how to predict the territorial behavior of starving wild scavengers just to make it through the week. You survive a death world by learning that everything operates on a hidden pattern. Even chaos has a rhythm if you watch it long enough. Speaking of hidden rhythms, Severick said, rapidly switching his display from the terrifying statistics of Earth to a highly classified casualty log he had managed to decrypt using his species' hive mind processing algorithms. I have been analyzing the historical fieldwork data on all past Umbraxis encounters. I reviewed the fatalities. There is a glaring anomaly. Nali pulsed a sharp, bright green light, signaling intense curiosity. An anomaly in a near-total mortality rate. Precisely, Severick replied, his multiple eyes locking onto the data streams. Look closely at the kill sequences from the past 50 years. The Umbraxis does not simply slaughter the closest biological target at random. I cross-reference the biometric telemetry from the last 14 failed observation expeditions. The creature achieves maximum lethality only when its prey moves in a predictable, synchronized rhythm, or when the team experiences a unified wave of panic. Orun frowned heavily, the sound reverberating like shifting gravel deep within his chest. Synchronized panic. You mean when a tactical squad relies on standard military retreat formations? Exactly, Severick confirmed, highlighting a dozen red data points on the screen. When a field team falls into a textbook defensive perimeter, or when their heart rates and adrenaline spikes align in unified, collective terror, the Umbraxis strikes with perfect, unavoidable accuracy. It targets the synchronization itself. Dax felt a cold, sharp spark of realization ignite in his mind. He stared at the glowing holographic data, watching the red lines of previous failures intersect. The pieces of the puzzle were finally beginning to align. This creature is not just physically overwhelming, Dax stated, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. It is not a mindless killing machine lashing out blindly at anything that breathes in its territory. It actively reads emotional patterns. It anticipates standard, logical survival protocols and uses those exact protocols against the prey. Dax looked up at his three terrified companions, his expression hardening into a mask of pure, cold resolve. The Academy is wrong. They describe this predator as a chaotic, unpredictable force of nature, because they are looking at it through the lens of standard biology. But this thing is smart. It is reading the fear of its victims. It might be vastly smarter than any textbook we have been given. The descent into the restricted observation vault felt less like walking into a research facility and more like entering a high-security tomb. Accessing sublevel 40 required overriding 6 separate biometric checkpoints and navigating a labyrinth of lead-lined corridors entirely devoid of the Academy's usual bustling student traffic. When the heavy, blast-proof doors finally hissed open, the air inside was biting, carrying the sharp metallic tang of ionized ozone and heavy radiation shielding. In the dead center of the cavernous room stood a multi-layered stasis chamber, isolated from all other holding cells by a vast expanse of reinforced flooring. It was anchored by thick, pulsating energy conduits that pumped continuous streams of dampening fields into the central cylinder. As the group approached, the opaque outer shielding of the chamber slowly retracted, sliding upward with a heavy, grinding mechanical groan. They did not see a beast. They did not see snapping jaws, or razor-sharp claws, or any of the classical anatomical markers of an apex predator that the xenobiology textbooks so eagerly detailed. Instead, resting suspended within the gravity-nullified core of the chamber, was something that completely defied standard biological logic. It looked like a physical manifestation of a collapsed star, a long, low-slung body composed of what appeared to be coagulated, absolute night. Its hide did not reflect the harsh observation lights. It actively devoured them, leaving an unsettling void in the center of the room. As the creature breathed, its massive vertebrae shifted and rolled under the surface not like bone, but like a thick, heavy liquid moving under high pressure. Capping its skull was a stark, brilliant contrast to the darkness of its body, a complex, sweeping crown of metallic white spikes that resembled an intricate array of sensory antennas, more than defensive horns. The sheer presence of the Umbraxis seemed to break the fundamental laws of physics within the room. Every time the creature caused even the slightest shift in its liquid spine, the dozens of high-fidelity recording lenses ringing the chamber violently glitched. The holographic data streams hovering above the consoles warped and stretched, bleeding into chaotic colors. The visual feeds distorted, bending the light around the creature as if the very fabric of space was being continuously caught and torn on the edges of its dark form. While Sevrix, Nali, and Orun stood paralyzed by a primal, suffocating terror, completely immobilized by the visual impossibility of the creature. Dax stepped closer to the primary observation glass. He ignored the mind-bending spatial distortions. His eyes bypassed the terrifying aura of the abyssal hide and focused intently on the intricate physical details of its massive torso. Running across the thickest sections of the creature's chest and wrapping tightly around its lower neck were dozens of deep, jagged scars. The tissue had healed, but the pattern of the damage was unmistakable to someone who had spent their childhood patching up wildlife on a violent, planetary coast. These were not the incidental scratches acquired during a frantic hunt. They were not the wounds of a predator plunging recklessly into a herd of prey. The deep gouges were layered, overlapping, and concentrated entirely on the frontward vital shielding. They were the desperate, punishing marks of a creature that had anchored itself in one place and taken extreme, repetitive damage to protect something positioned directly behind it. While Dax studied the biological history written on the creature's skin, Nali silently bypassed the terminal's physical interface, shifting their internal light spectrum to match the frequency of the optical data cables. The photonic student slipped a tendril of raw energy straight into the restricted archives. Nali's environmental suit flared a sickly, pale yellow, projecting the stolen data onto the glass right beside Dax. The official capture records for the Umbraxis were not just classified. They had been aggressively butchered. Page after page of the digital dossier was violently redacted. The planetary coordinates of its discovery were entirely wiped clean. The ambient environmental conditions of its native habitat were replaced by string after string of null values. Most disturbingly, the official strategic justification for the Academy's military intervention and subsequent capture of the creature had been completely erased, leaving a glaring, undeniable hole in the institutional narrative. Orun placed his massive, dense hands against the thermal shielding of the stasis controls. Deep, grinding vibrations resonated within his crystalline chest as he processed the ambient energy bleeding from the chamber's life support systems. "This is not a preservation state," Orun rumbled, his voice a low, horrified tremor that shook the dust from the ceiling grates. "I am reading the base thermodynamic output and the core magnetic resonance. The Academy is intentionally flooding the chamber with a dissonant magnetic frequency, and they have dropped the ambient thermal baseline to a near-crippling extreme. They are not housing it. They are perpetually suffocating it. They are forcing it to exist in a state of continuous physiological torture, likely to weaken its gravitational abilities or intentionally induce highly erratic behavior." Dax absorbed this information without breaking his gaze from the creature. A redacted history, a torture chamber disguised as a stasis pod, defensive scars on a creature classified as a mindless, aggressive killer. He took another slow, deliberate step forward, bringing his face within inches of the hyperglass. He focused entirely on the stark white, metallic crown of spikes, trying to decipher the complex geometry of its sensory array. He formed a single, quiet thought in the absolute stillness of his mind. "You are not a monster at all. You are a prisoner of war." The Umbraxis stopped breathing. The liquid shifting of its spine froze instantly. Slowly, with terrifying deliberation, a single, massive eye opened in the center of the dark mass. The iris was a burning, abyssal violet, and it locked directly onto Dax's pupils, with an intelligence so sharp and piercing it felt like a physical strike. A fraction of a second later, the high-fidelity audio speakers mounted in the corners of the vault crackled to life. "You are not a monster at all. You are a prisoner of war." The voice, echoing through the sterile, freezing room, did not belong to a machine. It did not belong to a translation matrix. It was Dax's own voice. The cadence, the heavy inflection of his earthborn accent, the quiet, contemplative tone. It was a perfect, flawless mirror of his internal monologue, broadcasted outward with a half-beat delay. The reaction from the alien students was instantaneous and catastrophic. Severix let out a metallic shriek, his multiple legs scrambling frantically against the floor as he scrambled backward, violently crashing into a diagnostic console. Nolly's containment suit erupted into a blinding, strobing sequence of pure crimson light, the ultimate photonic manifestation of a total psychological system failure. Orun simply locked up, his dense joints freezing solid as a defense mechanism, turning him into an immovable statue of panicked rock. Only Dax remained perfectly still. He did not retreat. He did not flinch away from the violet eye that was still boring holes into his consciousness. He reached slowly into his utility pocket, pulled out a small, physical notebook, and smoothly uncapped a pen. He pressed the paper against the glass, right in front of the creature's massive gaze, and carefully wrote a single, steady line of text. Not just an apex predator. Demonstrates highly advanced strategic intelligence, capable of seamless cognitive simulation and direct telepathic or auditory feedback. You should not be this close to the containment barrier, Mr. Calder. The voice came from the shadows near the blast doors, soft but carrying an immense, heavy weight. Dax lowered his notebook and turned his head. Professor Terrell Vox stepped slowly into the pale light of the vault. The ancient alien scholar looked entirely out of place in the sterile, high-security environment. His usually impeccable academic robes looked slightly disheveled, and his posture was uncharacteristically slumped. Dax looked into the face of his formidable instructor, and for the very first time since arriving at the prestigious academy, he did not see the cold, calculating strictness of a legendary xenobiologist. Staring back at Dax, hidden deep within the dark, scaled folds around the professor's eyes, was a profound, suffocating anxiety. It was a dark, heavy secret that had been buried alive. And Dax realized in that silent moment that Terrell Vox knew exactly what was locked inside the glass. And he was absolutely terrified of what was about to happen. The preparation phase felt less like studying for a final dissertation and more like organizing a highly classified orbital drop. The 4 students commandeered an abandoned subterranean engineering bay, turning the damp, dimly lit space into their tactical headquarters. They constructed a rigorous, 3-tiered operational strategy. Severix and Nolly would manage the aerial observation and biometric tracking from a hovering skiff positioned high above the engagement zone. Orun would monitor the structural integrity of the terrain and the localized gravitational fluctuations from a secondary, fortified overwatch position. That left the ground approach, the absolute epicenter of the danger zone, entirely to Dax. When the Academy quartermaster offered the standard-issue heavy composite plating designed to withstand direct kinetic impacts, Dax categorically refused. The heavy suit was a technological marvel, boasting an array of automated life support systems and reinforced exoskeleton joints. But it weighed over 40 kilograms and relied entirely on the Academy's central wireless network to function. Dax chose an alternative loadout. He stripped his gear down to a subdermal cooling mesh to regulate his core temperature during extreme exertion, a pair of heavy-duty magnetic grip boots, and a thick spool of high-tensile mechanical tether. He swapped the digital tracking modules for a physical resonance beacon, an analog sample knife, and a purely manual signal transmitter. He wanted a loadout that was light, infinitely flexible, and completely independent of any external software. If the central network went down, his gear would still operate flawlessly. Every morning at exactly 0500 hours, Dax locked himself inside the advanced variable gravity simulator for 3 unbroken hours. He did not program the room for combat scenarios. He did not practice firing energy weapons or executing complex martial arts strikes. Instead, he programmed the chamber to simulate catastrophic spatial anomalies. He trained his nervous system to react instantly when the vector of gravity suddenly shifted by 90 degrees, throwing him violently toward the ceiling or slamming him into the padded walls with the force of a speeding transport vehicle. He practiced twisting his body in midair to ensure his magnetic boots always found a solid surface before his spine snapped against the bulkheads. He was not training to overpower the predator. He was training to ensure he did not die from a single miscalculated footstep when the creature inevitably shattered the fundamental laws of physics around him. While Dax bruised his ribs in the simulator, his team worked tirelessly on their respective specialties. Severix dismantled a standard atmospheric rebreather, intricately rewiring the microscopic internal mechanisms to create a highly sensitive, custom pheromone filter. He paired it with a microscopic vibration counter capable of registering the faintest tectonic tremors through the soles of Dax's boots, allowing him to feel footsteps before he could see them. Nolly, realizing that standard radio frequencies would likely be scrambled by the creature's ambient energy fields, engineered a purely optical language capable of transmitting over 500 distinct tactical concepts. They developed a complex system of silent, color-coded light pulses that could broadcast spatial coordinates and hazard warnings without emitting a single decibel of sound. Orun spent 12 continuous hours utilizing his innate mineraloid resonance to process the geographical data of their assigned testing zone. He generated highly detailed three-dimensional models of floating basalt corridors, meticulously calculating the structural stress points to predict exactly where the massive rocks would fracture when the gravity fields violently collided. The atmosphere in their underground bunker grew increasingly heavy, stretched as tight as a high-tension wire just moments before snapping. The true nature of their situation broke wide open the night before the scheduled examination. Dax was calmly sharpening the edge of his sample knife when his heavily encrypted personal terminal buzzed with a single, untraceable text message. It bypassed every security firewall the prestigious academy possessed. The anonymous sender offered no greeting and no context, delivering only one chilling directive. Do not let the exam drag past the 12th minute. The stark warning carried the weight of an impending execution order. Dax showed the message to the group. Orun immediately interfaced with the Academy's master architectural grid, cross-referencing the coordinates of their assigned testing zone. The heavy, rocky plates of his face ground together in a harsh, grating sound of profound alarm. The administration had quietly updated the venue without issuing a formal notification. They were no longer assigned to the standard research dome meant for academic practicums. The system had rerouted their final examination to Sector Echo 9, a decommissioned biological arena located deep in the lower planetary crust. It was an ancient, brutalist structure built over 200 years ago, previously utilized for highly classified military combat training, not biological observation. They immediately contacted Professor Terrell Vox via a secured, encrypted channel to demand an explanation for the sudden shift. The old xenobiologist looked pale and thoroughly exhausted through the flickering holographic feed. He claimed the venue change was a strictly administrative decision, a forced relocation mandated by the High Council due to sudden, critical maintenance failures in the primary research domes. His voice remained strictly professional, but his eyes constantly darted away, entirely refusing to meet the camera. He abruptly terminated the connection before Dax could ask a single follow-up question. Orun did not believe the flimsy administrative excuse for a second. He pushed his consciousness much deeper into the digital blueprints of the old biological arena, painstakingly mapping the subterranean infrastructure layer by layer, searching for anomalies. What he found buried in the rusted, forgotten core of the facility brought a suffocating, terrifying silence over the engineering bay. The arena was not just an empty stone maze waiting for a beast. Embedded deep within the high basalt walls, seamlessly disguised as standard environmental regulators and atmospheric scrubbers, were exactly 24 dormant automated security turrets. They were heavy, military-grade kinetic cannons capable of shredding armored infantry into fine dust. Those weapon systems had absolutely no logical reason to exist, let alone remain connected to a central, high-capacity power grid during a standard student examination. Dax stared at the architectural schematics glowing ominously on the terminal. The disparate pieces of a massive, terrifying puzzle finally locking into place. The shadowy figures controlling the Academy board did not simply want a group of students to observe the Umbraxis. They wanted to fundamentally test how the apex creature would react to a uniquely resilient human target inside a perfectly controlled, highly weaponized environment. They were treating the final exam as a live-fire laboratory, a manufactured crucible designed to violently escalate the situation and force the creature to reveal its ultimate combative potential on camera. Sensing that the events of tomorrow were going to violently breach the boundaries of a simple academic exercise, Dax quietly walked over to his personal equipment locker. If the powerful people running the test were willing to plant hidden artillery in a student arena, they were undoubtedly prepared to hijack the group's digital safety tethers the very moment things got interesting. Dax opened a hidden compartment in his trunk and began slipping a selection of highly illegal, purely mechanical tools into the hidden pouches of his tactical harness. He packed a set of titanium spring-loaded climbing pitons, a friction-based spark striker made from compressed flint, 2 vials of highly corrosive industrial acid encased in shatterproof glass, and a completely analog inertial compass that operated entirely on planetary magnetic lines. He prepared himself for the inevitable, disastrous moment when every single digital system they relied upon simultaneously betrayed them. He was walking into the snare entirely on his own terms. The day of the examination brought the entire Intergalactic Academy to a grinding, unprecedented halt. Lecture halls were abandoned. Research laboratories sat completely empty. Tens of thousands of students, alongside faculty members and high-ranking administrative officials, flooded the reinforced observation galleries overlooking Sector Echo 9. Millions more tuned into the live holographic broadcasts transmitted across the station. Nobody in the massive audience viewed this gathering as a simple academic evaluation anymore. The atmosphere was heavy, suffocating, and thick with morbid anticipation. They were congregating to witness either a profound historical milestone or a highly publicized collective mass obituary. Below the heavily shielded grandstands, the biological arena waited. It was a staggering, nightmarish landscape that defied natural planetary physics. Massive, jagged columns of black basalt hovered suspended over a bottomless, churning abyss of pure magnetic force. The entire subterranean maze was shrouded in a thick, suffocating haze of crimson plasma and boiling mineral fog. This dense, charged atmosphere acted as a natural dampener, creating dozens of insurmountable blind spots that instantly rendered standard thermal, optical, and biometric tracking sensors completely useless. It was a chaotic, floating graveyard designed to swallow light and sound alike. High above the treacherous floating rocks, Sevrix, Nali, and Orun maneuvered their sleek observation skiff into a stable holding pattern near the arena ceiling. Down below, the heavy containment locks of the ground-level entry gate hissed open, dumping a thick cloud of pressurized steam into the red abyss. Dax stepped out alone. He did not sprint. He did not draw his physical blade. He simply walked forward, descending into the swirling crimson mist, with slow, measured steps, looking exactly as though he were calmly marching into the gaping maw of a living, breathing planet. The audience in the galleries held a collective, agonizing breath. Every compound eye, optical sensor, and binocular lens strained desperately to catch the very first glimpse of the apex nightmare. They fully expected a deafening roar to shake the basalt columns. They braced themselves for the thunderous crunch of heavy footsteps, or a violent, tearing blur of motion launching from the shadows to obliterate the fragile human instantly. Instead, they got absolutely nothing. The vast arena was consumed by a suffocating, unnatural silence. It was not a peaceful, quiet calm. It was a distorted, heavy absence of sound that felt inherently wrong. A predatory vacuum that made the chests of the spectators tighten with phantom anxiety despite their perfectly secure locations behind 3 meters of transparent armor plate. This total lack of sensory feedback was the opening strike. It was a psychological weapon, brilliantly utilized by the creature to shatter the nerves of anything foolish enough to step into its domain. The silence screamed of an unseen watcher. Dax moved with deliberate intent, his heavy boots locking and unlocking magnetically with the rough basalt beneath him. He ignored the thick fog swirling around his knees and focused his dark eyes entirely on the physical environment. He breathed slowly, keeping his heart rate locked in a steady rhythm, refusing to let the heavy atmosphere trigger his adrenaline. Near a cluster of shattered, floating stalagmites, he found something that made him halt his advance. Fragments of heavy exploratory drones, the very machines the academic archives claimed the creature completely ignored, were scattered across the stone. But as Dax looked closer, he realized they were not scattered randomly. The jagged pieces of metal and synthetic casing were deliberately arranged in a wide, sweeping arc, forming an artificial, highly visible barricade that perfectly blocked a narrow side passage. He swept his gaze further down the primary path. Deep, cyclic claw marks scarred the towering stone walls on his right. The gouges were rhythmic, creating a subconscious visual funnel that practically screamed at any living creature to stay away from the rock face. He then checked the shadowed, recessed alcoves scattered along the left side of the path. The exact dark corners any terrified prey would instinctively dive into for cover. Inside, every single one of those seemingly safe hollows lay a carefully piled mound of ancient, bleached bones. Dax breathed out slowly, his breath misting faintly in the cold, plasma-tinged air. The Umbraxis was not merely an ambush predator waiting blindly in the dark for a lucky strike. It was a masterful environmental architect. It meticulously designed its territory, using metallic debris, visual threats etched into the walls, and false havens to subconsciously herd its prey. It choreographed the panic, forcing its victims to run exactly down the path it desired. The creature did not just hunt, it directed a flawless, psychological execution. A normal biological target, overwhelmed by the oppressive silence and the subtle, terrifying visual threats, would instinctively follow the path of least resistance. They would avoid the barricades, flinch away from the clawed walls, dart into the bone-filled shadows, and funnel right into the ultimate kill zone. Dax looked down the obvious, seemingly safe central corridor. He paused for 3 seconds. Then, he turned his body exactly 90 degrees away from it. He stepped completely off the primary basalt plate, leaving the prescribed path, and vaulted onto a steeply angled, highly unstable ridge of floating rock. The new position offered absolutely zero cover, overlooked the magnetic abyss, and possessed no logical tactical advantage whatsoever. He intentionally and blatantly shattered the behavioral pattern a terrified victim was supposed to follow. The retaliation was instantaneous, and it was utterly terrifying. There was no physical beast leaping from the thick fog. There were no flashing claws. Instead, the very fabric of gravity beneath Dax's feet violently and suddenly inverted. A localized massive kinetic pulse slammed upward from the dark core of the floating rock. The sheer force of the anomaly bent the light around him, emitting a deep, sickening hum that vibrated through the teeth of every spectator in the arena. The massive basalt ridge bucked like a wounded animal, the ground flipping entirely upside down in the space of a single, chaotic heartbeat. The sudden, extreme sheer force was perfectly calculated. It aimed to launch the human directly off the rock and plunge him straight into the crushing, inescapable magnetic storms tearing through the abyss below. The viewing galleries erupted into a unified, deafening scream of collective horror as the small human figure was violently thrown toward the void. Many alien students turned their eyes away, entirely unable to watch the inevitable, gruesome conclusion. But Dax did not fall. In the final, razor-thin fraction of a second, before the immense gravity wave threw him completely clear of the stone, his rigorous, agonizing training in the simulator took over. He did not panic. He twisted his body violently in midair, fighting the crushing inverse pressure. He slammed his arms forward and drove his legs down, engaging the heavy, titanium-reinforced magnetic anchors of his boots straight into the jagged, underside lip of the flipping rock. The powerful magnets caught with a bone-jarring, metallic crunch, arresting his downward momentum instantly. His joints screamed in protest, his shoulder muscles tearing slightly under the sudden, immense strain. Hanging completely upside down over certain death, with his boots anchored to the bottom of a floating stone and the roaring magnetic abyss swirling mere meters below his head, Dax let out a heavy, ragged breath. He looked down into the churning, lethal void, then slowly reached up to wipe a streak of cold sweat from his forehead. Despite the agonizing pain radiating through his arms, and despite hanging over a literal death pit, Dax Calder smiled. The smile was not born of arrogance, but of pure, profound realization. The brutal, near-fatal strike was a beautiful confirmation. It proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that his very first hypothesis was absolutely, undeniably correct. The beast was watching, it was thinking, and it was perfectly capable of being surprised. He heaved his aching body over the jagged lip of the floating basalt plate, his boots locking onto the right side-up surface with a heavy, reassuring magnetic thud. He waited for the immediate follow-up strike, bracing his stance for a frontal assault. It did not come. Instead of capitalizing on the spatial chaos it had just created, the Umbraxis dissolved entirely back into the swirling, crimson plasma. The ambient temperature dropped drastically, frosting the edges of the stone. The dense fog rolled heavily over the empty arena floor, swallowing the massive creature completely. For the millions of spectators watching across the galactic network, the sudden absence of the beast was infinitely worse than its visible presence. It left the entire academy suffocating in a state of formless, creeping dread, staring at an empty, red-tinted holographic feed where a nightmare was supposed to be. Then, the oppressive silence broke. Calder, adjust your vector immediately. Structural integrity is failing on your left flank. The voice drifted clearly through the thick mist. It was Severix. The cadence, the underlying metallic synthesizer rattle, the precise clipping of the alien consonants. It was a flawless auditory reproduction of the insectoid. But Dax knew, with absolute certainty, that his team was under strict orders to maintain total radio silence unless a catastrophic mission abort was triggered. A moment later, a different sound pierced the heavy air. A high, desperate, photonic shriek that seamlessly translated into the frantic, terrified voice of Nali. Dax, please. The observation skiff is caught in a massive thermal downdraft. We are falling. You have to help us. Up in the shielded grandstands. A cold wave of realization washed over the diverse student body. The apex predator did not merely hunt with crushing physical force or spatial manipulation. It weaponized basic empathy. It perfectly mimicked the auditory frequencies and emotional distress rhythms of its prey's pack, actively attempting to trigger the deep-seated biological instinct to rescue fallen comrades. Dax anchored his boots firmly to the stone, refusing to move. He knew his team was safe in the high-altitude overwatch position. He forced his breathing to remain steady. Then, a third voice drifted softly out of the dark shadows. "Dax, sweetheart, the storm is breaking the seawall. You need to come inside right now." The blood in Dax's veins turned to absolute ice. That was not a teammate. That was his mother. It was the exact, trembling tone she used during the Category 5 hurricanes on the eastern seaboard of Earth. A voice filled with tight, suppressed panic and desperate love. No one on this station, no one in this entire star system, possessed that specific audio file. The creature had aggressively pulled the memory directly from his own mind during their brief, telepathic connection in the stasis vault. For 3 agonizing seconds, the stoic human facade shattered. Dax actually pivoted his body. His magnetic boots disengaged, and he took one frantic, entirely irrational step toward the swirling red mist where the familiar voice originated. The psychological illusion was staggeringly perfect. It pulled at the very core of his humanity. But just as his heel hit the stone, a microscopic discrepancy snagged in his hyper-focused mind. The echo of his mother's voice bounced off the basalt pillars, a fraction of a heartbeat too late. And the faint thermal displacement in the surrounding fog did not match the biological volume of a human throat. High above the arena, Severix's compound eyes widened in sheer horror as he rapidly processed the incoming telemetry from the atmospheric sensors. He flashed a frantic green light pattern to Nali. The insectoid realized the fake audio was not just empty sound. Every single time the Umbraxis produced a voice, it simultaneously generated localized, directed microgravity ripples. The beast was literally pushing the physical sensation of urgency and panic through the air, forcing the prey's nervous system to physically react to the heavy, emotional weight of the sound. It was an invisible, tactile assault on the mind. Down on the floating rock, Dax violently shook his head, physically snapping the hypnotic tether. He reached up to the side of his neck and manually deactivated the auditory receptors on his cranial mesh. He completely and utterly surrendered his sense of hearing. From this exact moment forward, trusting his ears meant certain, brutal death. Instead, he closed his eyes for 2 deep breaths and shifted his entire consciousness into his physical body. He became a creature of pure tactile feedback. He measured the exact rhythm of his own expanding lungs. He felt the microscopic vibrations of the basalt vibrating upward through the thick, rubberized soles of his boots. He calculated the subtle shifts in the dense fog pressing against his bare cheeks, and he monitored the precise recoil of his own knee joints against the shifting gravitational currents beneath the rock. He was no longer looking for the monster. He was feeling the empty space where the massive monster had to be. He was hunting in reverse, using his own biology as a raw seismic sensor. He needed to draw the creature out into the open. Knowing the Umbraxis was meticulously monitoring his every muscle twitch for a sign of weakness, Dax deliberately manufactured a fatal mistake. He feigned a sudden, clumsy stumble, dropping his left shoulder and breaking into a heavy, uncoordinated sprint. He ran diagonally across the floating plate, moving exactly toward the origin point of the fake voices. He played the part of the panicked, emotionally broken prey flawlessly, but his chaotic trajectory was meticulously calculated. He was leading the invisible terror directly over a specific fault line in the basalt, a jagged, structurally compromised fissure that Orun had highlighted in his thermodynamic models exactly 12 hours prior. The trap finally sprang. The Umbraxis erupted from the plasma fog with zero warning, tearing through the heavy air with a speed that entirely defied its massive, liquid bulk. It was a localized eclipse, a terrifying blur of coagulated night and razor-sharp metallic spikes launching directly at Dax's exposed spine. Dax felt the sudden, violent absence of air pressure behind his neck and threw his body aggressively forward. He disengaged his magnetic locks and executed a hard, punishing slide across the abrasive stone. The lethal, sweeping strike missed, severing his torso by a margin of merely 2 centimeters. However, the sheer kinetic wake of the lunging beast, coupled with the absolute outer edge of its shifting, liquid-like claw, caught his right shoulder. The heavy, protective synthetic fabric of his uniform tore open like wet paper. Flesh and muscle parted under the extreme force. A bright, vivid arc of crimson blood sprayed across the dark, superheated basalt, instantly turning to hissing steam upon impact. Dax rolled aggressively to his feet, gritting his teeth hard against the sudden, blinding flare of physical agony. His left hand instinctively clamped down over the deep, bleeding laceration, his fingers slick with his own blood. Up in the shielded observation galleries, the morbid thrill of the academic spectacle vanished in a single instant. The sight of bright red human blood boiling violently on the arena floor violently shattered the comfortable illusion of a controlled test. The air in the grandstands turned to lead. The absolute, unfiltered terror finally became real for the audience. Every alien student, every stoic professor, and every calculating administrator watching the live feed suddenly understood the brutal reality unfolding in Sector Echo 9. They were not watching an arrogant Deathworlder perform a reckless, physical stunt to prove human superiority to the galaxy. They were witnessing a high-stakes, hyper-lethal game of psychological chess. The shadowy creature was a certified genius of slaughter, and Dax Calder was operating on a razor-thin edge where a single misjudged vibration, a single misplaced footstep, or a single moment of yielded instinct would result in him being physically ripped into pieces right before their very eyes. The final examination had completely evolved into a raw, bloody fight for the fundamental right to survive. The searing pain radiating from Dax Calder's torn shoulder was a grounding force, keeping his mind sharply tethered to the physical world. He clamped his left hand tighter over the laceration, ignoring the warm blood soaking into his reinforced thermal mesh. He did not retreat toward the perceived safety of the main path. Instead, he focused his entire attention on the ambient atmosphere. The violent lunge of the Umbraxis had left invisible scars in the local physics of the arena. There were faint, shimmering ripples of gravitational distortion hanging in the crimson plasma, a temporary trail of bent light leading away from the kill zone. Dax followed the distortions. He moved slowly, deliberately stepping off the primary floating plate and navigating down a jagged, highly unstable spine of fractured rock. Using his heavy mechanical spool, he secured a titanium python and rappelled down the sheer face of the floating island, descending deep beneath the primary observation grid. The thick mineral fog parted slightly, revealing a massive, hollowed-out basin completely concealed within the underside of the basalt formation. It was a blind spot so perfect it was entirely absent from the Academy's meticulously detailed architectural schematics. According to every xenobiology textbook and every declassified field report Dax had studied, an apex ambush predator's lair should have been a macabre treasury of death. He expected to find a localized slaughterhouse, a dark pit overflowing with the crushed armor and bleached bones of 1,000 victims. He found nothing of the sort. The air inside the hidden basin was completely devoid of the metallic tang of blood. It was significantly warmer than the rest of the arena, strictly regulated by a localized, gentle thermal updraft. Resting in the very center of the smooth stone depression were 3 massive, oval-shaped mineral cocoons. They were pristine, glowing with a soft, internal luminescence that pierced the heavy dark. As Dax stepped closer, he could feel a faint, rhythmic vibration pulsing through the soles of his boots. The stones were emitting a weak, synchronized resonance. It felt exactly like the slow, steady beating of 3 unborn hearts waiting in the dark. Dax took one more step toward the center of the hollow. The response was not a calculated, psychological ambush. It was a catastrophic explosion of raw, unadulterated fury. The Umbraxis materialized out of the shadows with a velocity that threatened to shatter the surrounding stone. The sheer kinetic force of its charge was terrifying, carrying a gravitational pressure that forced Dax backward, driving the breath entirely from his lungs. It was an assault, multiple magnitudes more violent than anything the creature had displayed on the surface. Dax threw his weight backward, scrambling wildly over the rough basalt to put distance between himself and the nest. He expected the massive beast to follow through, to crush his ribcage and finish the execution it had just initiated. But the very moment Dax crossed an invisible perimeter, backing away from the three glowing stones, the Umbraxis abruptly halted. It dug its heavy, liquid-shifting claws into the rock, arresting its own lethal momentum entirely. It did not pursue him. It simply anchored its massive body to the floor, spreading its metallic white crown wide. The creature transformed itself into a living, impenetrable wall of coagulated night and razor-sharp spikes, standing squarely between the human intruder and the three pulsing cocoons. High above the arena floor, Nolly was frantically processing the raw biometric telemetry through their optical language matrix. The photonic entity realized the energy signatures radiating from the massive beast and the delicate cocoons were perfectly synchronized. Nolly flashed a rapid, blinding sequence of pale blue and gold down to the observation skiff's terminal. Sevrix translated the optical burst, his mandibles trembling so violently his vocal synthesizer emitted a harsh, grinding static. The Umbraxis documented in the restricted archives was categorized as a hyper-aggressive, solitary male. That classification was the foundational pillar of every tactical assumption the Academy possessed. It was also an absolute, categorical lie. Cross-referencing the real-time biological data, Nolly and Sevrix arrived at a shocking, world-shattering conclusion. They were not looking at a rogue killing machine. They were looking at a female in the absolute peak of a gestational nesting cycle. A highly complex biological phase that the intergalactic scientific community had either completely missed or intentionally buried. The horrifying puzzle pieces of the past several decades suddenly slammed together in Dax's mind with sickening clarity. The near-absolute fatality rate of the historical observation teams was never the result of a monster hunting for sport or sustenance. Those heavily armed expeditions had blindly marched into active nurseries. The academic establishment had brutally invaded her home, and she had simply held the line. Galactic science had systematically recorded the desperate, agonizing defense of a mother as the ultimate, undeniable proof of an unredeemable monster. Dax remembered the deep, overlapping gouges carved heavily into the chest plating of the creature back in the stasis vault. The true nature of those wounds finally made perfect sense. They were not the incidental scratches of a careless hunter pulling down desperate prey. They were the brutal, agonizing marks of a living shield. She had taken every single kinetic round, every plasma burn, and every crushing blow directly to her own vital organs just to keep the fire away from her children. She fought to keep her nest breathing, not to fill her stomach. A sharp burst of static hissed in Dax's ear. The encrypted communication channel, strictly reserved for catastrophic emergencies, cracked open. It was not a teammate. It was the heavy, exhausted voice of Professor Terrell Vox. The old xenobiologist finally broke his silence, his tone stripped entirely of its usual academic authority. He confessed over the secure line that he had suspected this biological reality for over 20 years. He had seen the anomalies in the field reports. He had noted the defensive posturing. But when he brought his preliminary findings to the ruling academic council, they aggressively locked the files and threatened him with total excommunication, acknowledging that an apex black terror possessed a highly complex, empathetic maternal instinct would completely shatter their lucrative, galaxy-spanning military doctrines. The coalition government poured billions of credits into the Academy to study apex predators for weaponized applications and combat countermeasures. You cannot secure limitless defense funding to study a grieving mother protecting her young. The institution desperately needed a mindless, heartless beast to justify their massive budgets and their violent containment protocols. Calder, you have the data, Vox pleaded over the secure line, his voice thick with genuine, crushing regret. You have proven the hypothesis beyond any doubt. I am initiating an emergency extraction protocol for your sector. Hook your tether to the automated retrieval drone dropping from the ceiling right now. If you stay down there, Director Varric and the facility administration will purge the entire arena to bury this revelation. They will classify the creature as an uncontrollable, lethal hazard and authorize immediate, total containment. Dax looked up from the basalt floor. He stared directly at the massive, terrifying creature. Her violent violet eye was locked squarely onto him. But there was no predatory hunger in her gaze anymore. Beneath the terrifying exterior, beneath the reality-bending power and the terrifying metallic crown, there was only a profound, exhausted desperation. She was terrified of him. She believed he was just another wave of the endless violence that had plagued her existence. Dax reached up to his heavy tactical collar. He found the localized emergency extraction beacon, the single piece of Academy technology designed to pull him to safety. He ripped it from the fabric and crushed the delicate circuitry between his fingers, tossing the broken pieces onto the hot stone. He spoke clearly into his analog manual transmitter, ensuring his heavy earthborn accent carried up to his terrified teammates and to the compromised professor listening in the shadows. He stated flatly that he was absolutely refusing the retreat order. If he took the easy exit right now, the High Council would erase the footage, obliterate the nest to hide their institutional shame, and the Umbraxis would be quietly executed in the dark as an unfortunate academic accident. Dax tightened his grip on his analog sample knife, not as a weapon against the beast, but as a tool to cut through the lies. From that exact second forward, the final examination ceased to exist. It was no longer a desperate scramble to collect empirical data for a passing grade on a sterile transcript. It had entirely transformed into a brutal, unforgiving war against the very institution that sent him there. A desperate fight to keep the ultimate truth alive. High above the brutal subterranean landscape, secured within the climate-controlled confines of the primary oversight box. Executive Director Seln Varric watched the live biometric telemetry completely unravel his decades of carefully curated institutional lies. His immaculate, scaled hands gripped the edge of the control console tightly enough to crack the reinforced polymer. He did not see a brilliant academic breakthrough unfolding on the floating basalt plate below. He saw the immediate, catastrophic collapse of billions of credits in military defense funding. If the galaxy learned that the apex terror of Sector Echo 9 was simply a grieving mother, the Academy's lucrative weaponization contracts would evaporate overnight. Varric slammed his hand down onto the master override panel. He barked a series of rapid, encrypted commands into his private communication channel, his voice entirely devoid of the paternal warmth he usually projected to the student body. He ordered the immediate termination of the primary broadcast network. He commanded the central servers to scrub the last 10 minutes of recorded biometric data, citing a catastrophic localized sensory malfunction. Most chillingly, he authorized the manual awakening of the 24 dormant kinetic artillery turrets embedded deep within the arena walls, claiming the absolute necessity of protecting the human student from an unpredictable, rabid beast that had broken all standard containment parameters. Hovering just below the arena ceiling in their observation skiff, Severix intercepted the encrypted transmission. The insectoid's highly evolved auditory processors picked apart the subtle micro-tremors in the executive director's voice. The timing was entirely too convenient, the justification profoundly hollow. Severix processed the tactical geometry of the awakening turrets and arrived at a terrifying, undeniable conclusion. Varric had absolutely no intention of providing covering fire to save Dax Calder. The artillery was not targeting the perimeter to create an escape corridor. The crosshairs were converging directly onto the hidden basin. Varric was initiating a sterile, localized purge. He intended to vaporize the mother, obliterate the unborn cocoons, and turn the inconvenient human witness into unidentifiable ash before the thousands of spectators could fully comprehend the biological reality they had just witnessed. Oren refused to let the darkness win, as the primary holographic screens across the grandstands flickered and died, plunging the audience into confused murmurs. The massive mineraloid slammed his dense hands into the skiff's engineering console. He bypassed the Academy's primary firewalls by physically fusing his own crystalline energy matrix with the vehicle's communication array. He ripped the high-definition optical feed from Nolly's sensors and violently forced it through the Academy's auxiliary emergency alert network. Suddenly, every single dormant display across the massive orbital station roared back to life. The feed bypassed the grandstands entirely. It illuminated the cafeterias, the dormitory corridors, the botanical sectors, and the transit hubs. Tens of thousands of students, faculty members, and visiting dignitaries were abruptly transformed into captive, public witnesses to the highest level of administrative treason. The cover-up was dragged violently into the light. Down in the cavernous expanse of Sector Echo 9, the heavy kinetic cannons roared. They did not fire upon the Umbraxis. Instead, streams of hyper-accelerated tungsten slammed brutally into the massive basalt support columns, maintaining the delicate gravitational balance of the floating arena. The resulting explosions were deafening, a coordinated structural assassination designed to look like tragic collateral damage. The immediate effect was utterly devastating. The artificial gravity field violently destabilized, causing the entire subterranean maze to fracture like the tectonic plates of a dying planetoid. Massive chunks of superheated rock sheared off and tumbled into the roaring magnetic abyss below. The floating island containing the hidden basin groaned under the intense, sheer force, tilting precariously at a sickening angle. The violent tremor ripped through the smooth stone depression. The impact shattered the delicate thermal equilibrium of the nest. With a sickening, heavy scrape, one of the three glowing mineral cocoons was jolted entirely out of its protective alcove. The oval stone began to roll down the newly formed incline, picking up speed as it bounced toward the jagged, crumbling precipice. Up in the newly restored observation feeds, thousands of voices screamed in unified terror, fully realizing that a single additional vibration would send the unborn life plummeting directly into the crushing, inescapable void. The Umbraxis, who had been rigidly maintaining her defensive standoff with Dax, instantly interpreted the sudden artillery barrage, the fracturing rock, and the human's proximity as a coordinated, lethal strike against her bloodline. Her brief moment of hesitation vanished, entirely consumed by the blinding, primal fury of a mother watching her child slip toward oblivion. She unleashed a roar that physically warped the crimson plasma fog, a sound of such profound, grieving violence that it shattered the remaining acoustic dampeners in the arena. She abandoned her defensive posture and launched herself forward with a level of savagery that made her previous attacks look like mere warning strikes. Dax stood squarely in the center of the collapsing plate, facing the ultimate, terrifying intersection of physics and morality. He had less than 2 seconds to make a permanent decision. He could throw himself backward, scramble up his mechanical tether, and let the cocoon fall into the void, guaranteeing his own survival while the mother mourned. Or he could abandon his escape route, sprint directly toward the crumbling edge, and place his fragile human body completely within the immediate kill radius of a charging, grief-maddened apex black predator. He did not even blink. He chose the cocoon. Dax disengaged his magnetic anchors and threw his body into a desperate, reckless sprint across the tilting basalt. He ignored the deafening roar of the artillery overhead. He ignored the terrifying, liquid shadow blur of the Umbraxis, tearing across the stone just meters away. He dove headfirst toward the precipice, sliding hard across the abrasive rock his hands desperately reaching out for the glowing surface of the rolling stone. Watching the human willingly dive into a literal death zone to save an alien predator's offspring caused a fundamental, permanent shift in the dynamic of Group 7. The conditioned academic detachment evaporated. The ingrained, evolutionary fear of the void black monster vanished, entirely replaced by a fierce, undeniable loyalty to the madman from Earth. Severix bypassed the altitude safety limiters, shoving the skiff's primary thruster controls all the way forward. Nolly shifted their entire energy field into a blinding, tactical strobe, projecting rapid bursts of high-intensity light designed to blind the automated targeting sensors of the wall turrets. Orun pushed his internal resonance to the absolute limit, projecting a localized magnetic shield around the fragile observation craft to deflect the falling debris. For the very first time since the Academy was founded, the students who had previously considered Dax Calder a suicidal liability made the conscious, synchronized decision to plunge directly into the crossfire alongside him. They brought the skiff diving down through the crimson fog, a tiny metal spear plunging into the heart of the storm. The floating island shuddered violently as another volley of heavy tungsten obliterated a secondary support pillar. The massive, reinforced blast doors leading back to the surface corridors slammed shut automatically, their heavy magnetic deadlock sealing permanently as the surrounding rock walls warped out of alignment. The automated extraction drones, previously hovering near the ceiling, were crushed into sparking scrap metal by the collapsing stalactites. Every single avenue of escape abruptly ceased to exist. The engineered safety nets were completely gone. The arena was rapidly disintegrating. The corrupted administration was firing blindly into the dust, and the enraged mother was closing the final distance with lethal intent. As the dust settled and the remaining basalt plates ground against each other in the dark, every single person watching the broadcast understood the grim reality. The final resolution of the examination would no longer involve a safe, strategic retreat. It had become a raw, inescapable, and bloody confrontation where the only way out was straight through the fire. The final heavy blast of kinetic artillery sheared straight through a primary load-bearing basalt pillar. The resulting shockwave triggered the subterranean arena's ultimate containment failsafes. Massive interlocking sheets of reinforced durasteel slammed down violently over the upper gallery viewing ports, while the primary elevator shafts auto-fused their heavy magnetic deadlocks. The automated emergency extraction grid, their last theoretical tether to safety, flatlined instantly with a dull, sickening tone. The dome was entirely sealed. The group of 4 students was no longer participating in a severely compromised examination. They were firmly entombed within a crumbling, subterranean geode alongside a wounded deity. There would be no administrative rescue fleet arriving in time. From this exact second forward, they were entirely on their own. The protective mother had not escaped the frantic, blinding artillery barrage unscathed. A ricocheting shard of hyper-accelerated tungsten had brutally grazed her left flank as she threw herself across the open stone to shield her remaining offspring. It did not pierce her thick, vital organs, but it violently ruptured a cluster of specialized, bioluminescent sacs running along her lower ribs. These hidden organs were the biological regulators for her localized spatial manipulation. Now, thick, volatile violet fluid bled heavily into the crimson fog. With every single drop of that fluid that struck the hot stone, the gravity within the entire arena violently stuttered. Dax felt the air pressure warp sickeningly against his eardrums. The errant pulses of raw gravitational force bleeding from her side were no longer targeted tactical attacks. They were chaotic, uncontrolled hemorrhages of pure physics. Loose boulders floated upward into the plasma mist before slamming back down with bone-crushing force. The massive armored ceiling of Sector Echo 9 let out a deafening, agonizing metallic shriek. Dax looked up through the dissipating haze and realized the absolute worst-case scenario was rapidly unfolding. If the Umbraxis continued to be agitated by the pain and the threat to her nest, her biological reactor would achieve a catastrophic runaway state. She would not just slaughter the 4 students trapped on the floor. The resulting spatial implosion would rip the entire structural canopy down, dragging the thousands of spectators sitting in the secured galleries above, straight into a grinding, inescapable meat grinder of falling durasteel and tearing magnetic storms. The only physiological mechanism capable of venting that escalating internal pressure was the intricate crown of metallic white spikes resting upon her skull. It served as her biological grounding rod, a dual-purpose organ that directed her gravitational currents and transmitted soothing resonance frequencies to her unborn nest. To stop the impending chain reaction and manually vent the building spatial pressure, Dax had to physically reach that crown and forcefully sink his own resonance beacon directly to her neural output. The sheer logistical impossibility of that task was staggering. Between Dax and the enraged, bleeding mother lay a single, fractured bridge of raw basalt. The narrow stone archway was completely detached from the main bedrock, slowly and erratically rotating on its central axis, high above the churning magnetic abyss. Crossing it meant exposing himself to a point-blank, entirely unshielded confrontation where every single uncontrolled spatial pulse bleeding from her wounded flank could effortlessly launch him off the stone and into the crushing void below. It was a literal tightrope walk over the mouth of hell, against a terrifying beast that actively controlled the gravity pulling him down. The alien students did not hesitate to support him. Operating from the heavily damaged skiff, hovering dangerously close to the crumbling stone, they threw themselves into a synchronized rhythm of desperate survival. Severix pushed his biological processing power to the absolute breaking point, his compound eyes tracking the chaotic splatters of violet fluid. He calculated the highly erratic intervals of the gravitational stutters, feeding Dax the exact fractions of a second when the ambient pressure would spike and drop. Nolly completely bypassed their standard optical communication constraints, weaving their raw photonic energy into a complex, pulsating sequence of warm amber and soft gold. They were flawlessly mimicking the precise, rhythmic fetal heartbeats of the mineral cocoons, projecting the soothing light directly into the mother's peripheral vision to create a desperately needed sliver of cognitive dissonance. Down in the fractured ravines below the bridge, Orun utilized his immense mineraloid density. He ripped open a ruptured industrial thermal pipe with his bare, rocky hands, forcefully redirecting hundreds of gallons of supercooled liquid nitrogen through the porous basalt fissures beneath the arena floor. The extreme cold seeped rapidly into the stone, bleeding the ambient thermal energy from the air and significantly dampening the violent volatility of the creature's uncontrolled spatial surges. As Dax secured the heavy canvas straps of his tactical harness, he keyed open the short-range communication channel, connecting him to his 3 companions. For the very first time since the ordeal began, the calm, unnerving stoicism of the human from the extreme Deathworld completely fractured. "I am terrified," Dax whispered into the microphone. His voice was rough, completely stripped of its usual deadpan confidence, carrying a slight, undeniable tremor. He did not say it to elicit pity, nor was he succumbing to blind panic. He simply stated an empirical, biological fact. The psychological effect on his alien teammates was profound. That quiet, brutal honesty anchored them. It stripped away the intimidating myth of the invincible, terrifying primate. They realized he was not a sociopath immune to horror. He was a fragile, mortal creature who felt the exact same suffocating dread they did. Yet, he was still consciously choosing to step directly into the fire. That single admission forged a bond of trust infinitely stronger than any academic pledge. It made them believe in him completely, because a man who acts despite his paralyzing fear is far more reliable than a man who claims to feel none. Dax reached into his utility pouches and entirely dismantled the standard-issue tools provided for his academic grading. He laid the components out on the rough stone, He took his physical sample knife, the thick spool of high-tensile mechanical tether, a pair of heavy-duty magnetic climbing hooks, and the cylindrical resonance beacon. With rapid, heavily practiced motions, he began binding them all together. He lashed the heavy beacon firmly to the hilt of the blade using thick wraps of the tether, then secured the magnetic hooks to the outer casing to act as crude, interlocking barbs. He systematically transformed a collection of harmless observational instruments into a bizarre, makeshift spear. It was a completely absurd piece of engineering, an academic weapon that looked like a desperate, pathetic joke against an apex black titan. Yet, it was the exact precision instrument he needed to deliver a concentrated frequency payload directly into her sensory array without losing his grip when the gravity inverted. Across the entire orbital academy, a silence so profound it felt physically heavy settled over the countless holographic displays. The frantic, terrified murmurs in the cafeterias completely died away. The calculating professors in the faculty lounges stopped breathing. Millions of eyes watched the solitary human figure rise slowly to his feet amidst the swirling crimson fog. Dax Calder did not draw a kinetic firearm. He did not activate a shimmering energy shield or call for a tactical orbital strike. Gripping his ridiculous, hand-tied spear of raw science, he stepped out of the protective shadows and placed his heavy magnetic boot onto the edge of the slowly rotating basalt bridge. He was not walking to his execution, nor was he marching forward to slay a mythical monster to cement his own glory. He was stepping into the chaotic abyss to forcefully stop the most advanced, enlightened civilization in the known universe from committing a permanent, unforgivable mistake. The Umbraxis tore free from the crimson plasma like a shredded patch of the midnight void. Each massive footfall upon the rotating basalt bridge physically warped the surrounding space, bending the narrow stone archway into agonizing, unnatural angles. The sheer gravitational pressure of her charge preceded her like a tidal wave. Dax Calder did not turn his back. He did not retreat a single step. He stood his ground on the crumbling stone, locking his eyes onto the chaotic blur of coagulated night. He calculated the exact millisecond of impact. Instead of dodging completely, he leaned directly into the strike. He allowed the creature's immense, liquid-shifting shoulder to violently collide with his already lacerated right side. The impact was devastating, producing a sickening crunch of bone and tearing mesh. But he used that exact, brutal momentum to throw himself downward. He slid smoothly underneath her massive, sweeping neck, simultaneously slamming his dual magnetic hooks deep into the pitted surface of the bridge. The battle instantly devolved into a terrifying, intimate clash of raw physicality. It was a chaotic storm of flying basalt shrapnel and tearing claws. The enraged mother thrashed wildly, her metallic talons carving deep trenches into the stone mere inches from the human's face. Erratically shifting gravity pulses whipped through the air, violently throwing Dax's lower body entirely off the edge of the bridge. He hung suspended over the magnetic abyss by nothing but the desperate grip of his anchored hooks and his screaming arm muscles. Above him, the beast was frantic, driven entirely mad by the burning pain in her flank, the overwhelming need to protect her unborn, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the tiny creature fighting beneath her. Through the thick, swirling dust, a brilliant, pulsing sequence of soft gold and warm amber cut across the dark. Nali was broadcasting the exact resonant frequency of the glowing cocoons from the hovering skiff. As the light washed over the creature's head, Dax looked up through his own blood and sweat. He stared directly at the intricate, stark, white crown of spikes. The realization hit him with the force of a kinetic round. Those spikes were not merely biological conduits for spatial manipulation. They were highly sensitive auditory receivers and transmitters. They were the biological mechanism she used to broadcast the comforting, rhythmic pulse of life down into her nest. It was her parental call. The Umbraxis reared back, preparing to bring her massive weight down to crush the human into the stone. Dax did not raise his physical blade to find a soft spot in her armor. He did not attempt a killing blow. As the crushing gravitational field pressed down on his chest, threatening to snap his ribs into splinters, he thrust his makeshift academic weapon upward. He drove the modified resonance beacon directly into the center of her metallic crown. With a violent twist of his wrist, he locked the beacon onto the spikes and forcefully synchronized its output with the exact frequency Nolly was broadcasting. The device emitted a powerful, booming pulse of soothing, rhythmic resonance directly into the mother's sensory array. The effect was instantaneous. The Umbraxis froze completely. Her massive claws suspended a fraction of an inch from Dax's throat. The chaotic, crushing gravity fields abruptly stabilized. The burning, violent violet of her massive eye flickered, the blind rage draining away to reveal a sudden, profound shock. For the very first time, she truly saw the bleeding, broken creature beneath her. She processed the soothing frequency flooding her mind. She finally understood that the human was not a hunter trying to slaughter her bloodline. He was a desperate, fragile being, actively trying to restore the safety signal to her shattered home. At that exact, fragile moment of revelation, the tectonic groaning of the arena reached a critical threshold. A massive chunk of the upper canopy sheared loose, plunging toward the rotating bridge. Simultaneously, the violent tremor knocked a second glowing cocoon from the hidden basin, sending it skidding toward the precipice. Dax did not hesitate. He released his right magnetic anchor, completely abandoning his only physical lifeline to the bridge, and lunged desperately across the tilting stone to wrap his body around the falling egg. He braced for the crushing impact of the falling ceiling debris. It never came. The Umbraxis shifted her massive, liquid body with terrifying speed, entirely covering the human and her cocoon. The falling basalt boulders slammed violently into her armored back, shattering into harmless dust. The apex predator had just become a living shield for a student from Earth. The millions of spectators watching the broadcast fell into a stunned, absolute silence. The political fallout was immediate and utterly merciless. Broadcasted live across the entire Intergalactic Academy, Executive Director Seln Varek was stripped of his authority the moment the rescue crews finally breached the sealed dome. His desperate commands to silence the feed and activate the lethal turrets were laid bare for the governing council to judge. Professor Terrell Vox stepped forward, his voice steady and unyielding, providing decades of suppressed empirical data to formally testify against the administration. The terrifying Void Beast was immediately reclassified. She was stripped of her apex black monster status and officially designated as a high-tier, hyper-protective predator existing on the very threshold of strategic, emotional sentience. Group 7 was awarded the highest academic score ever recorded in the history of the xenobiology program. But the true value of their harrowing final examination was not a mark on a digital transcript. Through blood, broken bones, and a refusal to accept convenient lies, they had undeniably proven that the entire galactic scientific community had spent a century confusing the terrified panic of an invader with the desperate, beautiful protective instinct of a mother. Months later, deep within a newly established, highly classified planetary reserve, the first of the mineral cocoons finally cracked open. The newborn Umbraxis was tiny, its liquid shadow body still soft, its gravity pulses weak and uncoordinated. When the automated monitoring drones hummed to life, the hatchling did not cower, nor did it lash out in predatory fury. It simply sat on the warm stone, its small metallic crown glowing softly. It remained completely calm, soothing itself by listening to a very specific audio track playing softly from the enclosure speakers, the slow, steady, recorded heartbeat of Dax Calder. The brutal fight for a simple homework assignment had not merely rewritten a textbook. It had shattered the old paradigm, opening a brilliant new era of understanding between humanity, the apex beasts of the wild, and the entire watchful galaxy. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts together. And please subscribe to the Sci-Fi Stories channel, like the video, and support us even more by hitting the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people.